Um, Once again, welcome on behalf of Swedwatch. We are here, quite a diverse community from funders and donors, companies, academics, civil society, all here because a rising trend in mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence laws, which require companies to closely examine, prevent, and address human rights abuses and environmental damage within their value chains, have a potentially transformative impact on the 450 million workers and hundreds of millions of impacted community members within global value chains. While the European Union Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is being renegotiated, other companies are proceeding forward with their own legislative proposals in South Korea, in Indonesia, in Switzerland, Thailand, and Canada, not to mention a range of both sector comprehensive and issue-specific laws that are already in place. So the trend towards mandatory due diligence continues. However, our recent report from Swedwatch found that a lack of quality funding for worker representative and community-based organizations and the ecosystem of actors who support them severely undermines the ability of communities and workers to hold companies accountable and to access justice. A mere 0.62% of combined annual funding from governments and foundations supports due diligence approaches. And when we looked specifically at foundation funding, we found that critical strategies like protection measures, legal support, and community organizing account for just 0.11, 1.3, and 2.14% of that already very limited pool. The strategies which drive approaches which are led by communities are suffocated right now by a lack of funding. That is before we even discuss the quality of funding. The vast majority of funding out there is inaccessible to those actors from within and with most trust within communities who are most vulnerable to business impacts. It is inflexible to their ways of operating and the strategic approaches they choose, and often doesn't even cover the time period necessary to file a grievance, let alone see the grievance process through to reach remedy. Moreover, communities and worker organizations we speak with often frame their efforts to address business impacts within a much broader effort to also address economic security, political rights, a healthy environment in their biosphere, and cultural rights. But funding is so narrowly siloed that it prevents those holistic approaches. And so, at the same time as we have that picture within the funding landscape, resources are flooding towards industry approaches which are reliant on company self-disclosure. Estimates of the ESG rating service market size, for example, show that it is 80 times larger than foundation funding for research and documentation, despite relying on self-disclosure for over 80% of its human rights related data. The world that leaves us with is one where rights violations risk being drowned out in both the volume of data within ESG approaches and company efforts to suppress stories of harm. This means that even responsible businesses and purchasers will struggle to identify harms within their value chains, particularly for harms to the most vulnerable who have the least access to raise their voices. Funders and donors, and indeed private actors, must step up to rectify this situation. It is both a moral and strategic imperative. Changing the incentive structures for the core activities of businesses and global value chains is one of the most efficient ways to reach a wide range of rights holder priorities. If implementation of these laws are truly worker and community driven, the ramifications will impact public health, climate systems, food systems, poverty reduction goals, among a wide range of other rights holder priorities, given the sheer size and capital within global value chains. Within then the context of the global funding crisis that we are facing right now, these mandatory due diligence laws present an opportunity, and one that is both the responsibility of human rights and business and human rights funders and those funders and donors whose priorities are impacted by business activities. And so today we have with us a group of speakers who are implementing or proposing solutions for funders and donors who want to invest in this work, and to do so in a way which shifts power to workers and communities to enable approaches which are driven by them, rather than top-down approaches driven by company practice or indeed funding practice. There is a tendency, I think, in our community to identify poor funding and assume that we have to reinvent the wheel. That is far from the case. I encourage you to look at the report, which we'll post in the chat and a little later on. There are a number of funders and donors who are and have been doing quality work for years. The next steps then are about shifting more resources to those models and understanding how we can create better connectivity and solidarity between the ecosystem of funders and donors and those they are supporting. So today I'm very happy to have an excellent group of speakers with us. We have Joseph Bumuhanji, the chairperson of the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability, Amalia Sousa, the founder of the Casa Socio-Environmental Fund, Grace Mainji, executive director for the Kenya Community Development Foundation, Olivier de Schutter, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, and Mariana Leite, Director of Program for the Center for Economic and Social Rights. They each come at this from very diverse perspectives and entry points, which I think reflects the wide approach we need to take as a community to think more rigorously about how we are investing in rights holder driven approaches. And so, with that in mind and that framing in mind, I will just begin right away by introducing our first speaker. So Amalia, our report, as I indicated and is very unsurprising, has shown that far too little of funding available is going to community-based organizations and the actors who have trust with impacted communities. That fundamentally undermines the ability of those communities to access justice and hold companies accountable. The CASA Fund was started by activists from within the communities who fund within and is governed by those activists and resources community organizations and movements who are deeply impacted by business activities. You also helped to start the Alianza Fundos del Sur, a network of 16 socio-environmental funds across the Global South. So I wondered to begin this conversation if you can describe how your fund approaches resourcing community actors who are impacted by businesses and what lessons your model and that of the Alianzo can provide for funders who are looking to channel larger amounts of resources and funds to community-based actors. Over to you, Malia.
Okay, thank you, Ben. And thanks everyone thank you for the invitation. Because this is a very important aspect of the reason we created this fund, CASA Fund. So as you said, we came from the actors in the field. We are turning 20 years old this year, but we started 20, at least personally, I started 20 years earlier and other co-founders even earlier than me, because we were looking at the field, how philanthropy was talking about protecting major biomes in the world. Of course, we have the Amazon here, but Amazon is connected to the Pantanal, to the Savannah, to all of the biomes. We were looking at a whole region. So when we founded CASA, we set it up as a South American fund, because biomes are whole. You can't say, I'm going to save this side of the forest or this margin of the river. So we were looking at the whole aspect, and we already were working in networks. I think that the strongest thing that we have, Latin America is known for this, but I think especially South America, is how people work together, how we identify weaknesses and strengths in each other. And so this movement was already going on for a long time, and we were identifying the gaps. Usually international funders, no matter how much they care about something in somebody else's country, usually the Global South, there's so much they can do directly, right? So usually the funds go to very, very large, mostly international NGOs, maybe some national, doing great work, but that's their limit. And we, as actors, were seeing that this was not solving the problem, that without reaching directly the communities most affected by the destruction of their territories, of our major biomes, and having them become the subjects of their own solutions. They have the solutions. And so we made that bet, and it's paying off really. And so specifically in this area, so just to give a major overview, it's a hugely multiple approach. You have to fund everything that is necessary. So what we do is we see the macro to act in the micro. which doesn't mean small little projects that don't do anything, right? Which is usually what comes to mind when you say small grants. It's not about the size, it's about how they are placed and how they interconnect, and how it's like the system's dynamics approach. The closer you are to the system, the more you belong to it, the faster you can react. So quick feedback loops, the leverage points, we can identify this very fast. We can move, we can adapt ourselves to respond. So that's how we were designed, literally. And for that reason, we have been able to identify a lot of communities dealing with huge impacts of mega projects. And so from the very start, even 20 years ago, as we partnered with some of the foundations, Mott Foundation is one. For 20 years, we have had special funding, although I can't say it's big, right? It's been like, anyway, 200,000 a year, maybe, but dollars. But still, it's consistent. So we have a track record of funding groups directly affected by mega projects in general in South America, but especially with the lens of producing electricity or energy. So hydroelectric dams and systems. So I can give you like a quick list of the industries that we have been identifying as making strong impacts in the communities, and how we have been funding in those areas. So production of energy, so hydroelectric dams, wind parks, that's a very recent one. There's been a lot of impact. It's great to have renewables, but the way that they are being installed on top of communities' land in the Northeast, and driving away their fish, and when they live from that. So there's a lot of issues there. So we're working with communities or funding them to develop safeguards for themselves, for how to negotiate new, the new relationships of the expansion of this industry. Transmission lines, there's a huge impact. There's some compensation, but it's all a very, very complex process. Gas and oil, exploitation. So we've been funding communities affected by oil spills, about oil drilling in their territories, and how they have been organizing, or even sometimes to stop new processes like that, using legal framework like the international conventions. And I think this is one element that they can begin to use now, knowing that this is getting strong. But legal mechanisms, there's some legislation, of course. So Brazil has the public ministry. One of their jobs is to secure the rights of traditional communities, indigenous peoples, the Afro-descendants, and some other territories, and of national parks. So a lot of these in this industry, mainly when you talk about the Amazon or large important biomes, they are really impactful in terms of flooding huge areas of forest. So the combination of traditional communities and environmental protection has been some of the elements that the public ministry can work with the community to use. For example, the ILO Convention 169, free and informed consent. As you said in your paper, and still it also happened there, there's a lot of fake use of that. Somebody signing a paper or not letting people know that there was going to be a public hearing, that they should be there, getting them to understand what that was, right? So there's been a lot of our funding has been going exactly to prepare and improve the ability of communities to be able to engage, to be able to question, and that has been paying off quite a bit. I mean, not always, but this is because the funding is exactly, it's very small. So while we also fund solution-based approaches, that communities in areas where they're not yet being so threatened, they can improve livelihoods and they can be stronger as guardians of those places. There is a whole and huge area that we have to do So not some of the other industries are, building roads and pipes and ports and waterways to get products, or either to the coasts or to the ports, so through the water, through cutting forests, and the communities that are indigenous included, and some isolated indigenous communities are in those territories. So mining is a huge one, a lot of illegal mining going on. Agro industry, right? The agribusinesses like soy expanding, oil palm. Anyway, there's a number of industries. So we've been doing partnerships with funders. I think this is the last, I'm going to close here because it's a big conversation, but we've been able to make partnerships with some numbers, for example, pooled funds. The first one we did was were several European, mostly Dutch foundations that were pushing in Europe a moratorium against buying soybeans from areas that had been recently deforested of the Amazon. And so there was years of organizing and making sure the communities were engaged. So we had funders in Europe bringing the resources to us, and we were making sure that we were making those grants directly to the communities that were affected by the soy expansion. And we do that all the time. So this is a very efficient way, when funders, maybe one funder cannot fund everything that needs to do, but coming together. Today we are working with a pooled fund mostly based in the UK, where we're tackling a lot of that as well. So anyway, there are many ways that we can, as local funds, local channels that have the trust and the access to communities, that we can channel resources to very specific action and constantly. Because one of the things we learned in these fights is that they're long, that it's not about a year, it's not about 2 years. The Munduruku people, we've been funding them for 20 years. They finally got their land demarcated, but there are a lot of steps to it. So anyway, I'm going to stop here just to give you some inspiration.
Thank you, Millian. This is a good way to start the conversation because you brought up a lot of threads that will run throughout the remainder of the conversation. And I think it's important to highlight that reactiveness that community embedded funds can have, because accountability processes change all the time. And as you say, are long-term processes. So having trust with communities to react to the way that the industry responds to their efforts is very important. So I appreciate you bringing that perspective, and also the way that funds like yours can collaborate with pooled funds. I think as we're navigating now a much reduced landscape, those kinds of collaborative efforts and the connective tissue between the funding ecosystem will be important. But when you end there on the long-term funding, it's a good segue to Grace. KCDF, Kenya Community Development Foundation, have a bad habit of speaking in acronyms, has a long history of listening to community associations and working with them to develop sustainable resourcing models, which and strategies which respond to their needs. This includes your endowment fund model, for example. When we were conducting the report, a lot of the interviews highlighted that a lack of sustainable and predictable funding is a severe impairment on the ability of communities to leverage human rights frameworks. And so I wonder if you could describe now the work you do with community associations and the lessons that you can provide for funders and donors, and indeed businesses, on how to invest in community-driven efforts in this space. Over to you.
Thanks, Benjamin, and much appreciated for this opportunity to share perspectives from Kenya and the work that we've been doing over the last 28 years. As KCDF, how we work with different community associations, community-based organizations, NGOs, even organizations at the regional level, is really putting first the conversation around sustainability and how can we resource the work in a way that it's community-led. For us, that's very, very important, because we recognize that once the work is community-led, then it's more sustainable in terms of this investment of the community. They will put their own resources towards it. And what we see our role is as a facilitator. So as KCDF, we take this facilitative role as grant support. So we'd support different community organizations, associations with grant support. And we try, as Amelia said, we try to make sure that our funding support is not short-term, that it's long-term. Even if they're modest grants, how can we layer our grant support so that then any community association we're working with, at least we're able to work with them for a longer period of time, because we recognize the complexity of the issues cannot be solved in one project cycle. So having that ability, I think, is something that we would want to share with other funders about something to explore. The other aspect for us around the grant support is we try to ensure that whatever support we're giving is really community driven. We do not impose our ideas, our assumptions. We really try to check our biases about what would work. So we put priority to what does the community want and what do they want support with. We really try to caution ourselves to stop thinking that we have all the answers or that we're coming in the savior mentality. And what that looks like is you have to invest time in listening to communities, being amongst them, understanding where they're coming from, and recognizing that a lot of the solutions they have, what they probably just require is just a bit of accompaniment, a bit of funding support in this one area or the other. So part of our capacity strengthening focus is around how do we help communities to mobilize? How do they mobilize support? How do they, even for community associations or NGOs, move outside of their sector approach? How do they have a more systems approach thinking? And we do this by encouraging and inviting groups to think about coming together as communities of practice. We are working in this area, we know the issues, but just because, for instance, I'm working on an issue around water, it doesn't mean that I can't have a human rights lens. It doesn't mean that I can't have a voice around gender-based violence. And so we really try to encourage partners that we're working with, especially in a particular locality, to come together through the communities of practice model, but also through support that we give around how do you mobilize support? How do you get people to see the bigger systemic issues and come together? And how do you even mobilize local resourcing for that work? So we also have a focus around mobilizing local resources. And one of the key things that we do, it's not only about the hard cash that is mobilized, but also the in-kind support, whether it is money. Money is cash, yes, but whether it's experience, whether it's time, we need to cost that because that's also an important resource. So coming to communities without the assumption that they have nothing, everyone has something to bring to the table, and shifting the conversation, shifting the focus that money is everything and the only thing. I think for us, that's very core to who we are as KCDF. And we recognize that all we can do is play a facilitative role. And how can we do that in a way that communities take lead? They are driving the conversation and we are there to accompany. So as a community foundation, being able to mobilize resources from individuals, from private sector, from corporates, from foundations, but being able to ask those who fund our work to not impose what they want to see, to step back. And what that takes is trust. There must be trust when it comes to this sort of funding. And we focus for the partners that we're working with, we first focus on take money off the table. Do we have a relationship? How can we build the trust so that then we understand where they're coming from, they understand where we're coming from, and we move away from looking at, having a particular focus on, we want to find fault in what you're doing to justify our existence, to give capacity strengthening. And so we really try to have that focus as a community foundation. So what I would say to funders is, especially within this broader conversation, is to understand that some of the challenges are systemic. It's not one project, one size fits all. We must learn to appreciate what's happening in different contexts, not to impose our own ideas because we do have biases. Communities may not speak our language. We need to understand that. The same way private sector would speak, they would not understand probably how NGOs speak or those in the not-for-profit sector. So we must not use language as well as a way to discredit people's lived experiences. So we really need to have a focus on that. And then don't dominate support. we must see our role as supportive rather than dominative. Let me stop there, Benjamin, just to give others a chance to input. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Grace. I think that was very comprehensive and clear. Just a few points to pick up, I think, that are very relevant is this idea of community foundations and the role that they can play in building trust with communities. Communities who've been impacted by businesses have, in the last decades of experience, have learned to distrust formal accountability processes. So to engage them will be essential to build their trust in these systems and indeed in funders. And so I think that's going to be essential working with foundations like yours who have built long-term relationships with partners. So thank you for that. And then also the systems approaches and listening to community so they are driving those approaches will be essential. And unfortunately, far too little of funding is structured in a way that enables that. So I think that's an important call to make. If we shift now over to Joseph, Joseph, we've just heard from two funds who are working to support community-based actors. Our research though has shown that accountability is far more effective when there is an ecosystem of actors who are resourced together to engage in this case in due diligence processes. However, that rarely happens in practice. So funders and donors who support different kind of actors from community organizations to INGOs and support services rarely collaborate and rarely connect their partners together. You are both the coordinator for the Uganda Coalition for Corporate Accountability. You're also the chairperson for the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability. And so I wonder if you could describe the network model and how it enables that kind of connectivity between different types of actors in the accountability ecosystem, and also how you see networks playing a role in guiding funding strategies which link the resources of different funders into a more, coherent strategy. Over to you, Joseph.
Thank you, Benjamin, and it's a pleasure for me to engage with all the stakeholders on this webinar. Like I've been introduced, my name is Joseph Byomhanji. I coordinate the Uganda Consortium on Corporate Accountability and also currently serve as the co-chair for the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability. I'm going to share with our stakeholders on the call the models we have of running coalitions in pursuit of corporate accountability in Africa and beyond. I'll start with the national coalition, that's the Uganda Consortium on Corporate Accountability, which is a civil society consortium bringing together 25 organizations that are different in nature. Some are national, others are grassroots. And so the coalition brings them together to be able to jointly run advocacy projects and to be able to strengthen legal and policy frameworks with that web of mixed strength, because we have institutions of higher learning like the School of Law, Makerere University. You have a grassroots organization and a national organization all coming together to jointly pursue corporate accountability. And what that coalition does is to create a national platform that enables grassroots actors to be able to engage on particular issues, to feel the support of big national entities, and then the collective from the national then feeds into the regional coalition, which is the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability, that currently brings together over 132 members across 36 countries on our continent. So the strength in working together enables us to share knowledge across board, whether you're in a grassroots organization, whether you're in a public interest law clinic in a university, whether you're a national organization, you're able to come to a pool and share knowledge in the pursuit of corporate accountability. But the other strength is in jointly working together on issues of advocacy. Colleagues on the call know that advocacy around issues of corporate accountability requires partnership, it requires collaboration. You can't go at it as a single organization. So what these coalitions do for us is to create that platform of engagement, the platform of partnership, to be able to push back on the might of corporate actors. So I encourage the funders on this call to be able to pay attention to coalitions such as the models that we are running both in Uganda and at the African level, to resource them because they bridge the gap. Most of the funders structurally are not able, for example, especially the bilaterals, are not able to support grassroots organizations due to the requirements they have. So such grassroots organizations end up getting funding from philanthropic funds that look out for them specifically. And now the existence of the coalition is able to draw the linkage between the grassroots that would ordinarily be focused on by philanthropic foundations, but also the national that oftentimes get the funding from big bilateral donors because they have the compliance requirements that they need. So existence of coalitions such as ours is to draw that linkage and ensure that there is collaborative approach, there is collective advocacy, and there is partnership in pushing for corporate accountability. We are in a world that is currently moving from voluntary towards mandatory legal frameworks when it comes to due diligence, and that requires teamwork. And the coalitions are the vehicles that are able to get us there. So it would be of great importance for funders on the call to engage with coalitions such as ours as they are driving or drafting their funding strategies, to be able to appreciate how it has worked, because these coalitions have been in existence for over a decade. And so their lived experiences that we are able to share to inform funding strategies such that they're able to meet the needs of the organizations in their unique aspects, either as grassroots, national, or in the academia. So for me, that's my call to the funders on the call. We are available to share these conversations, to be able to share this experience so as to inform their funding strategies. So as I conclude, I hope that the value of these coalitions is greatly appreciated and support is continuously provided for us to have the shared platform for advocacy. The other thing I wanted to flag before I come to the conclusion is around the issues of project cycles. Much of this advocacy in the pursuit of corporate accountability is beyond the 2-year project cycle, the 1-year project cycle. So the flexibility in terms of time is also important to be considered as different funders are designing their funding strategies, so as to be able to meet the needs of coalitions. Thank you so much, Benjamin. I hope I used the 6 or less minutes I had to share this experience. Thank you.
No, thank you, Joseph. I think this is a really important call. And thank you for highlighting the role networks play in elevating voices from community-based organizations up to national and regional levels. I think networks are essential, but also, as you say, in building collective power and speaking with one voice, because it is a power asymmetry when you're engaging companies in accountability processes. So I echo that call and appreciate you joining us. Now, if we with the last two speakers, we're going to broaden the conversation a little bit, and this is intentional and reflects the wide approach that we need to take. And I'll begin first with you, Olivier. You've written in the past, and you've warned against box ticking and compliance-oriented approaches to these mandatory due diligence laws and legislative proposals. As we developed the report, we spoke with many worker representative organizations or supporting organizations. And we heard a consistent call that funders and donors should also be investing in the economic security of workers if they want them to be able to meaningfully engage with due diligence processes. They fear that otherwise, filing a grievance would cause workers to risk sacrificing their own employment if a brand were to, for example, disengage from the factory. And so the economic security gives them power and stability to leverage due diligence frameworks. You, together with ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, have recently called for a global social protection fund to be capitalized, among other strategies, through various innovative financing techniques, including targeted micro-levies on industries. I wonder if you could explain that call and what role you think that mechanisms like those micro-levies and the social protection fund can play in mobilizing resources which are necessary to build the economic security of workers.
Well, thank you very much, Benjamin, and great to be here. I would like to express my gratitude to Swedwatch for the report they presented that really addresses one important but neglected blind spot in the discussion on how to make human rights due diligence truly effective. I think it's not surprising that your interlocutors from unions in particular highlighted the importance of due diligence in strengthening their bargaining position and ensuring that they are provided with greater economic security. For me, it's really important to emphasize that globalization in and of itself, the ability for global supply chains to develop and for multinational enterprises to choose where to produce, where to import from, where to establish subsidiary entities, in and of itself, it could lead to a race to the bottom in which companies choose to put workers to work where wages are low and unions repressed and unable to fight for the rights of workers. And that could lead to a race to the bottom in which countries may be hesitant to improve working conditions and increase wages if they fear that they will be therefore less competitive or less attractive to investors. And so, in fact, human rights due diligence is a way to ensure that globalization will contribute to poverty reduction and to improved economic security rather than the opposite, rather than encouraging cost competitiveness by lowering wages and repressing workers' rights. To me, this is particularly true for three guarantees that in human rights due diligence should be considered. The first one is the right to a living wage. We have made significant progress in international human rights law in recent years in defining what a living wage is. And there is now an expectation that companies, wherever they operate, even if the minimum wage set in legislation locally is lower, they should at least pay this living wage to workers. And that means essentially a wage that allows the worker to support himself, herself, and his or her family, taking into account the costs of education, health, housing, transport, and so on. So there's an agreed upon definition of what a living wage should mean, and it's increasingly something that companies should be attentive to in outsourcing production or in subcontracting certain parts of the production chain. The second important contribution concerns the formalization of work. We have today some 61% of the working population globally that is still in informal work. It's 85% in sub-Saharan Africa. It's particularly important in some sectors such as agriculture, the building sector, or certain services sector, such as in the delivery and retail industry. But it is a major problem that many people who are working are neither paying taxes or social contributions, nor are they effectively protected by domestic labor legislation and social security because they are not registered as workers. And again, in due diligence, companies outsourcing production should ensure that their subcontractors, the business partners whom they work with, the subsidiaries which they control, formalize the workers, register the workers, and therefore ensure that these workers are covered by legislation protecting working conditions and protecting them with access to social security. And the third example is child labor. We have 138 million children in the world, 8% of children who are in child labor, in other terms, not able to continue to go to school because they are working. 54 million are in hazardous work. And that is, again, a major issue, jeopardizing the future of whole regions. Again, due diligence is to address that. And I would like to really emphasize that the benefit of a better enforcement of due diligence legislation is not simply for the workers or the communities, it's also for the companies themselves, for the transnational corporations that control global supply chains and are able to spread their operations globally. In fact, that's the reason why in the 1980s, international framework agreements started to develop. Companies wanted to protect their reputation. And we have many studies showing that there's a very strong business case for companies complying with human rights across the supply chain. Socially responsible investment is growing in the world, and investors are now much more attentive to this dimension. They will not invest in a company if that implies a risk to their reputation. Many consumers are increasingly attentive to this dimension too, and only buy from companies that they can trust. We also know that if a company is accused of being complicit in human rights violations, it will face very serious damage to its bottom line, and will scare out investors and be at risk of paying enormous amounts in litigation fees. And so there are many reasons why it is in the interest of companies themselves to buy this insurance policy, if you wish, by ensuring that nothing happens in the supply chain that they control that might make them complicit in violations. So equipping unions, equipping communities, equipping individual victims to allow them to use the tools available to challenge and highlight potential human rights violations in supply chains is really contributing to this process through which globalization becomes a force for the good rather than a threat, as it results in low-wage jurisdictions being preferred by unscrupulous investors trying to exploit workers who are economically insecure and not able to be well defended by unions. So this is why I am here as Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, why I think it's an important report highlighting the need to better support communities and unions in using the tools that we have, and in fact also to defend these tools against the attacks that recently, particularly in Europe, we have seen against these new tools that are provided to unions and communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olivier. And I think where you end there is very, very important, that there is also often a false dichotomy that's presented that a rights-respecting organization and value chain is somehow antithetical to business or competitive interests, and that's false. And I think increasingly there's that empirical data you reference that proves that. And the implication you draw there that it's important for industry also to contribute to equipping unions and community organizations with the tools to leverage these frameworks as a way to address them and address the conflict that can arise within supply chains is essential. So I appreciate that and the remarks you made there. I think this is something, you know, as funding and traditional funding decreases, how we think about leveraging and engaging industry to pay their fair share to unions and organizations and community-based organizations through independently governed funds is going to be an essential component of the strategy moving forward. But often I think how you do that is not resourced by funders and donors. How you set up those models, how you advocate for their implementation. There are some examples out there like the worker-driven social responsibility model, which in some cases includes industry fees, but it's rare. And so I appreciate that and echo that call from you. I know, you know, now we can shift. I think, Mariana, there will be a lot of connections between what Olivier was talking about in drawing this wider picture and your remarks. You have written in the past about how the EU CSDDD, for example, has a very narrow implementation scope. You've written about how investments in mHREDD should be considered as one part of a toolkit, which is in a broader framework of a rights-based economy, and how just a myopic focus or a limited focus on just due diligence without addressing the kind of systems drivers which produce the corporate harms that we're talking about in the first place can limit our ability to address those harms. And so I wonder if you could describe, what the rights-based economy framework is and how it could help donors and funder groups even to develop systems approaches which see, these new legislative frameworks as one part of a toolkit towards reaching the rights-based economy. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben, and thank you to our fellow panelists for really for the excellent report you published, but also for framing this in a very positive and solutions focused way. I think this is very much needed in the current environment we are. So thank you for that. I will touch upon 3 points. One is contextual related issues or the structural issues, as some of us here in the panel have mentioned. Secondly, the cosmetic compliance or instrumentalization issues that are related to mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence. And then thirdly, then go into a more positive solution-focused mode, which is more what does it mean to imprint it in a transformative and rights-based lens to economic policies. So on the first point on the contextual issues, when we talk about capitalism or neoliberalism, it is important to really understand that neoliberalism has a bias towards an everlasting thirst for growth and profit. And Olivier has written about this and is doing a great roadmap on what does it mean to move beyond growth. And I won't touch upon that, but what does it mean is that there are inherent policies that are connected to capitalism or neoliberalism that are focused on issues such as reducing taxes, relaxing labor legislation, lowering accountability to facilitate this race to the bottom that has been mentioned. Secondly, on this first point, I think it's very important for donors to be conscious that funding that does not take this into account runs a danger of legitimizing neoliberalism and the status quo. So neoliberalism or capitalism, as someone might call it, capitalism itself, and the rights violations that follow suit as a result of this everlasting thirst for growth and profit. So this is, I guess, linking to Joseph's call and to other calls here, such as Amalia's, is to really drive that message that our positionality and what we do in terms of the role we play, it's very important in this wider ecosystem. On point 2, on the point I was mentioning on the cosmetic compliance issues, mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence is a corporate concept that started from a financial analysis point of view. It really looked at de-risking, lowering the risk for a particular operation, like a merger or acquisition, for example. It does not depart from the perspective of protecting rights. So we do need to understand that, because it is a tool that already is inserted into a context that is already skewed towards profit and growth, but it also is a term that was serving a different purpose and the one that we want it to serve now. And why is this important? And this is the second element of this second point, is that at times we can push for what I call the humanization of economic terms. So we almost humanize and we almost try to make it work while it being a bit unfit for purpose. And this can potentially lead to what I call the marketization of human rights. And this is important because human rights then can become instruments or tools to then legitimize the status quo and legitimize a system that actually does promote exploitation and extractivism. So when we look at mandatory human rights, environmental and human rights due diligence, we need to look from this critical point of view. It is a tool. It's not perfect. And it does need to have certain adjustments that are need to be very much bottom up, as Grace was saying, context specific. Now, what can we do? How can we be positive and continue this thread that we're cutting across here in the panel for a solutions-focused approach? I think we need to imprint, and this is the third point, imprint a transformative and rights-based approach to economic policies more broadly, because mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence will not be able to deliver what it was envisioned, for example, by Ruggie when he created the UNGPs, if they are inserted into a distorted structure that is capitalist, it is patriarchal, and it is colonial. We do need to have an approach that is wider, and that understands that this is just one tool within a larger toolbox, and that needs to go into a direction of where we do reimagine our international financial architecture. And this means understanding the political economy of human rights, and how the human rights as a political project or historical project did depart from this approach of challenging oppression, as it was seen back then when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created. And then lastly, but I guess the most important point for our work as a Center for Economic and Social Rights, the rights-based economy or rights-based economies or human rights economies, as the Office of the High Commissioner calls it, can indeed guarantee material, social, environmental conditions to ensure people and planet thrive. This is, again, as I said, is a part of the wider toolbox, and I would say the wider thread in this particular toolbox to ensure that when we are talking about be it corporate policies, be it tax policies, be it labor legislation, it does depart from a particular point of view that promotes the realization of human rights. And this can be on one side, talking about principles. So for example, the human rights principle of the use of maximum available resources, which can connect to progressive taxation, promoting wealth taxation, or self exchanges that are related to tax corporation, or can be also linked to the human rights principle of non-retrogression. And this links to what Olivier was saying, to some of the backlashes we have seen, for example, on gender equality and women's rights. Or on the other side, it can be connected to very clear binding rules that have already been subscribed by member states and therefore should be implemented and delivered on. And not only in terms of the enabling space for the realization of human rights, but very concretely on what does that mean to deliver on specific rights. And this is related to government expenditure, which is, for example, on connected to social protection, or to government revenue. And again, talking about raising taxes here. And we have cases, for example, in Colombia that cut, for example, VAT for sanitary products in order to promote and to level the playing field when we're talking about women's rights. There was also a very good case in terms of social protection in the Gambia, promoting social protection and really pushing against austerity measures or fiscal consolidation, as some financial institutions call it. And that's also can connect to development assistance, thinking and pushing back on conditionalities that bind countries away from infrastructural investment. It can be connected to debt and deficit financing, and really pushing back or canceling illegitimate debt, or pushing against debt servicing that really reduce government's fiscal space to deliver on rights, such as the right to education and health. And lastly, on monetary policy and fiscal regulation that ultimately will lead to and influence the cost of housing, the cost of food, education, health, and so forth and so on. So I guess just to conclude, when we're talking about rights-based economies, we're talking about a normative guidance, a thread that will help policymakers develop and design new policies that are indeed protecting people and planet, but also a threshold or a litmus test or a way to monitor and guarantee that the policies that are indeed being used, such as mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence, deliver what they are set to deliver, and course adjust if that's needed. So I'll stop here. I'm more than happy to continue this conversation, and thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Mariana, and I appreciate that wide focus there at the end. I think, one lesson as we take, your remarks forward and think about its implications is that is obviously not the job of one funder or one donor, that requires, funders and donors who are working on political advocacy, that requires funders and donors who are working in different contexts, and a coordinated approach. And so I think, the lesson that I take from this conversation is that we need to be linking up funders and donors who are working on different but interconnected issues much more systematically and strategically. And I think the framework that you just outlined is one way to think about how we can connect them all together, including advocacy targeted towards international dialogues around debt policy, all the way down to some of the examples you brought at national levels with the policy conversations there. So I appreciate that, and I think this is a good way to open the conversation now to some of the questions from the chat. I think the conversation we've had is maybe wider than the typical business and human rights conversation we tend to have, and this is, I think, quite important. And so now I would like to introduce my colleague from ACCA, Dorcas, to jump on and moderate the questions that are coming in from the chat and send them back to our panelists to reflect on. And of course, during that conversation, we encourage our panelists to interact with each other. And if you have any questions or extra points you want to bring into the conversation, that's very welcome. But Dorcas, over to you now.
Thank you so much, Ben. And I would like to thank our panelists for sharing their insightful contributions to this panel. And thank you so much for making time for this webinar. So at this stage, we will take questions, and colleagues who have joined on the participant side, please feel free to drop your questions on the chat here for us. At this time, maybe just the first question to Amalia. Are you aware of independent accountability or grievance mechanisms that are working to bring private industries accountable, especially when there is alignment between state entities and the industry interests? You didn't?
Yes.
Should I?
Can
Okay.
I answer? Oh, I'm sorry. Is it? I'm supposed to just go, or are you gonna ask?
It's fine. We can just have a conversation. I can just be calling on you because we don't have really like a lot of questions. So I think it will be okay, Benjamin, if we just kind of question and answer.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Well, I'm gonna bring back what Grace said, and of course I didn't make it very clear. We don't do the work for the community, or we don't tell the community what they should be doing, but what we are, the closeness to the territories. So of course there's a number of different legislation, including national ones. I'm not particularly aware of that one, which is very good, and which I will definitely bring that into our team. But we don't guide what communities do. We respond to their needs and we adapt to their needs. We are going to, we've made over 4,700 grants in 10 countries. Our purpose is to reach them and figure out or listen very closely all the time. We make 10 to 12 calls for proposals a year. Any of them can involve these kinds of reactions to threats. It's all very broad. We do the same with our funders. You know, they can maybe give us money for a region or a public or a theme, but that's all. Everything else from then on is our consultation with community. So we are very aware of the territories where the threats are, which industries are playing there, but we offer the resources, the funding for them to get the information. We work closely with all the players. So yeah, so there's a lot of legislation we know about, not necessarily, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to know everything to be able to supply them with the resources and the capacity to react. So I think I wanted to make that more clear. The design is to scale and to make as many communities have access to means to protect themselves. And that's our job.
Thank you so much for that clarification. Okay, I think the next question can just be answered by any. It says, how do we encourage industry resources to shift from the funneling to profit services to rather collaborations with funds supporting community-based organizations? So I just welcome any of the panelists to just share on this one. Olivia, you want to contribute?
I'm glad to intervene, but probably not on your question because I didn't really grasp the question. I did see one question in the chat box concerning growth-led development and degrowth, and I could address that one.
Yes, please. Please go ahead.
No, so I would like to express my gratitude to Mathieu Verwijnt from Swedwatch for raising the question of degrowth. I think it's really important to see that within the United Nations, there has been for many years a sort of blind belief in the virtues of growth to contribute to development. And the quest for growth has been largely shared across all countries and UN agencies. We are now realizing that the measure of progress of human development is not to be assimilated to progress of GDP, and that post-growth or even degrowth options should be pursued. Why? Largely because growth has been extractive and exploitative. It's been based on the use or the overuse of resources without the ecosystems being able to provide these resources and to digest the waste and pollution we dump into the ecosystems. And it's been exploitative for workers and communities. And so there is now the search for other development models. And I believe that the human rights due diligence instruments that have developed are a way to ensure that we don't confuse economic growth with development. Sometimes economic growth can be counterproductive and really make development not easier, but more difficult to achieve, at least if we speak of well-being and human flourishing.
Okay. Thank you so much, Olivia. And I think we can take another question from Alison for you, Ben. He's interested to know to what extent enforcement of mandatory human rights due diligence requirements have been included within the bilateral cooperation agreements and or the free trade agreements. As such, provisions can be an effective means to leveraging cooperation and financing. Would you like to address that one?
Sure, and I would like to also throw it back to Grace and Amalia after I'm done at the end, which is I think it's to a large degree there can be quite significant challenges with how these requirements are included within bilateral cooperation agreements, so how embassies and how bilateral donors are shifting resources within different contexts, whether that be Kenya or Brazil or other country contexts. The provisions can be quite weak. I think there is a growing, there's at the European level, there is a coordination group of funders and donors who are trying to map out and identify the gaps and where funding is needed to invest in due diligence frameworks. And there are specific countries that have transmitted this down through their embassy teams. But it doesn't happen often. But in a way that actually supports communities and workers to leverage them. The question I would have though for Grace and maybe Amalia as well is, where is your experience in partnership with bilateral donors within your context? Do you partner with them? What does that look like? What do you need to engage in those partnerships more effectively? Because I think one of the lessons from our research is that to get bilateral funding in a way that's effective, you're going to need a lot more collaboration with philanthropic actors because bilateral donors have significant limitations on who and what they can support. And so I'm wondering either if you have experiences around collaboration or if you would have ideas around how those kind of partnerships could be structured moving forward.
Thank you so much, Ben. And I'm not seeing any other question here on the chat.
Grace, would you want to jump in on that? I saw you on mute.
Yes, I can. I think for us, when it has come to bilateral funding that we receive, we more often than not have to align it or get also philanthropic support to sort of be a cushion. Because bilateral funding, even if we're sub-granting, the conditionality is extremely high. The conditions that are put for maybe some of the community-based groups we're working with. So we have to de-risk that funding by having other more unrestricted support in case something goes wrong or a partner needs extra support. So that's where now the philanthropic funds come in very useful because it enables us to de-risk. Also, we, as much as possible, would want to create pathways for the community groups that we work with, the community-based organizations to receive this funding directly. But because of the thresholds that are required, whether it's, audited accounts for 5 years, they have to go through a due diligence process that, sometimes it can be very difficult for them to achieve because we're talking about organizations that would predominantly have volunteers, some of them. They won't have, for instance, a dedicated finance officer, and that would immediately discount them to be able to receive funding directly. So we come in, as much as we'd get the bilateral funding to support a particular project, we have to use unrestricted funding to either prolong the project or to give further support to the partner for them to be able to achieve some of the targets. So those are some of the challenges that are faced, and hence the need for us to always have the conversation around diversification of funding. Because then when bilateral funding either reduces or is cut off, then a lot of civil society organizations are left very vulnerable. So we constantly, encourage people where as much as possible, encourage your philanthropic funders to invest in helping you set up an endowment so that then that can also help your sustainability. Yeah, thanks, that's Ben.
Thank you. And I think Dorcas had to step away, but Amalia.
Okay.
Yes. Well, there's a number of things here in this aspect. We haven't directly gotten bilateral funding yet. We are actually finalizing a negotiation with IDB, but we have a very large partnership with the Brazilian government bank for about $10 million. And the reason that we're funding, it's in process, 400 grants, and then 5 meetings, so it's a national grant-making structure. But the reason that they decided not to try to do what we do, is exactly because of the bureaucratic system. So it is I would say we are a buffer, but yeah, cushion is a really good word as well. all of the funding. It doesn't matter if it comes from bilateral. We are now also applying jointly with other funds here in Brazil, the Human Rights Fund, the Women's Fund, the LGBT Fund, and us, Social Environmental Fund, to the Brazilian, it's actually to the Amazon Fund, which is a combination of funding from Norway and Germany and European governments. This is all extremely complex. But the main thing is the communities that we are designed to reach, they won't reach anybody else. Not even simple philanthropy. They just don't know this world exists. And that's the point of us being so close to the ground and so dedicated to pushing resources into the systems, the grass, into the roots of protecting major biomes, because we just take away all of the complexity. And that's the point. So the majority of our grants are between $5,000 to $10,000, more like 10, but we do make bigger grants between 20 to up to 100,000, much less, because our purpose here, and that's what I keep saying, it doesn't matter the issue, because there's so many issues besides corporate, actually, I think corporate pressure into the resources of these areas is the biggest problem by far, because that's what drives everything. It drives illegal activities, it drives invasion of territories. It's about illegal logging, illegal mining, illegal fishing, pushing in large agribusinesses into spaces, the palm oil, the cattle, the soy. So it's major, and it's everything at the same time. And what we've seen along all of these years is that, we were hearing about protecting the rainforest, right? I heard about this first time 40 years ago when Rainforest Action Network was founded, and I engaged right away, but it's been longer. And we are seeing that those places are shrinking, that the destruction is bigger and bigger and bigger. So whatever philanthropy is doing isn't working. It's already proven that it's not working. Anybody can see it's not working. So concentration of millions in very small pockets of possible solutions, for whatever reason, don't work. What works? And one of the things we do consistently, and I invite anybody to check, we have many publications demonstrating the impact of what hundreds or thousands of grants that reach communities that are the most important holders of knowledge of protecting those places. They've been already doing this forever, for thousands of years. They are the ones who need to be receiving direct support. And that goes for solutions, and it goes mostly for protection of rights. As I said, Munduruku people here it's a large population in the western part of the Amazon. We've been working with them for 20 years. They've been working, they've been fighting for 525 years. So it is a very, very long process. But what we're seeing is that when we engage, and it's not just our fund, but it's local funds, community funds, territorial funds, they're actually setting up their own funds, indigenous funds, Afro-descendant funds. The closest the management of resources is to the territory, the more effective it is. The further it reaches, the more legitimate it is. And so now the infrastructure for putting resources into the hands of these communities, it's not 1, 10, or 100. It's got to be everybody. And we need to be designed, and I think philanthropy in general, in all of the aspects, including this one, needs to understand that they need to change. They haven't been efficient. The only way now to be efficient is structures like ours, like ACDF, like CASA, like all the funds in the Global South, and that are so close to the ground that we are able to respond faster. So you very quickly, you turn a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle, because you can respond right away. We can adapt ourselves to the reality that they are confronting. This is the design, this is the new design of philanthropy that everybody should be looking at much more seriously, because it produces the result, the transformation that we're looking at. But we are all still, seen as very small and not visible enough. And we need to all join right now and just make more noise. And thank you for the space, because that's kind of what we're doing here right now. Just take a look. There's many different ways of tackling things like this that are more efficient at whatever, than just using the outside systems to come into our territories and try to solve our problems. Sorry, not to be rude. It's just a say.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing, Amalia. And I've seen a hand, Mariana. Would you like to share?
Yeah, I picked up two questions that flagged my name on the chat, and this links to also the question that Olivier answered on the degrowth and risk to communities, and what could be the potential role of the RB in mitigating those risks. I think for the Center for Economic and Social Rights, we see we also have this view that this vision around growth is not necessarily the most positive one. And when we're talking about vision away from growth, we talk about beyond growth, beyond the gross domestic product as the main metric whereby we need to measure success. So we do look at macro level and more of a global level, and that is not in replacement but actually going in parallel and hopefully helping some of the other strategies that are at other levels. The rights-based economy or right-based economies departs from a plural or pluralistic point of view. It aims to crowd in rather than crowd out. What does that mean? It means that it does acknowledge and embraces and pays deference to alternative economic models that have existed for decades and decades, like social solidarity economies, feminist economic models, and feminist macroeconomic solutions. So the rights-based economy or economies or enabling economies, they try to be context responsive, and they're very much driven by the bottom up. So it doesn't need to be, but rather promote what I said in terms of this normative or this thread that cuts across to really tie in economic policies to binding frameworks and principles. And this does connect to the principles I mentioned, but also very much connects to principles that aren't necessarily coming from a human rights, like pure human rights per se space, like common but different responsibility, or someone mentioned that in the chat. So for us, that does encompass that. There was a question about where we work in. CSR is an organization that exists for about 30 years. We work mostly at a global space, a global level, but we do work a lot with partners in the global south, and we are very much responsive to the work of our partners and try to enable and convene spaces and open up opportunities so then our partners can be able to operate and bring some of their issues to the global level spaces, particularly the UN, the World Bank, and the IMF. And what we do, we do agree with I do agree. I can say that more on a personal level because we haven't had extensive discussions on that lately, but I do agree with what has been said, for example, by Joseph, in terms of really thinking that how donors can fund on a macro, meso, and micro level, how those different levels of investment can and go towards one direction. What I can see from where I sit is that sometimes they can be quite one-off or discrete pieces of work that sometimes are not always renewed. Of course, we do have great funders, and we have some here on this call. that do provide core funding that's very much needed and essential for this type of work. So the second point, I would say core funding that does look at structural solutions beyond just tackling the symptoms of people systems. Long-term, sometimes funding can be very short-term, like 1 year. It's not enough to do the sort of work that we're trying to talk about. I mean, be it at very local level or being at global level, I think that unless there is a guarantee or an intention to renew it, I find it very, very hard to have the sort of impact we're talking about. And the point of flexible funding, I completely subscribe to that. Having flexibility and being responsive to the context is very much important in an ever-changing space like we have now. So I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Mariana. Okay, so I have another question for Mariana. Okay, it's from Fat. He says, how does the UN system help unions and community organizations to get justice if they use the complaint mechanism? And what's the geographic coverage of the rights-based economy?
Thank you. Maybe Olivier can also talk about the UN as someone who's can say as an insider who's been working a lot on that for many, many years and does great work. But on the rights-based economy, I can say that the idea is for this for the rights-based economy or to have more of a global footprint that does reach national and local level. What do I mean by that? It means that we see this as a way to influence things such as the role and accountability of international financial institutions and the international financial architecture, and how, for example, voting, the unequal voting of countries does influence, for example, debt systems that are very much tipped towards the favor of the global north and therefore former colonies. But then linking to the national level, which is really bringing, acknowledging, fostering, and applauding national level solutions that do go towards and creating an enabling space for the realization of human rights, and go towards having a set of policies that do promote a rights-based imprint to economic policies. So we see this as, let's say, almost a spider web, if that makes sense to you. And in terms of the UN, I can say from the perspective of civil society, is that I do find the UN very useful for particular for channeling some issue, so be raised at a more global and visible level, and sometimes almost creating this shield to communities and individuals that might be profiled and persecuted at national level, especially like the part of the UN system that the special rapporteur to on extreme poverty and human rights it's part of is very useful because it's very accessible and therefore a good way for us to exchange knowledge on that. But I have also feel that in some cases, and I've had this experience, for example, a Brazilian activist that had quite a lot of online, receiving quite a lot of online threats against them, and felt that being able to be visibilized in a UN space, like in Geneva, for example, protected them to some extent because their case became not only a very localized known case, but a case that did reach a different threshold, let's say. It did become a bit more well-known, and in some cases, they did find that that positive. So we try to be responsive in terms of how our partners see that system working for them rather than us saying what we feel that could do for them, if that makes sense.
That makes very clear sense, Mariana. Maybe Olivia, is it Olivia that
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. I would say very simply that within the United Nations, there is a growing awareness that we must move to a human rights economy. That is the terminology and the expression used by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk. And it fits within a broader set of initiatives that seek to think the economy beyond growth. The basic idea here is that to combat poverty and inequalities, it's not sufficient to compensate post hoc by redistributive policies those who lose out as a result of how the markets are organized. We also need to reorganize the markets and to make sure that markets create less inequalities and less exclusion. And the human rights economy is one that should empower those who have no power and no voice in order to allow them to be better able to benefit from how the markets operate. So there's a whole, I think, reflection going on how involving communities, democratizing work, strengthening unions, protecting workers by labor legislation that is effectively enforced can actually make the economy more humane and more conducive to the full realization of human rights. So it's not enough to compensate after we've caused the damage. It's important to prevent the damage from occurring in the first place by reforming markets in a human rights perspective. And I think that is what we are working on in the UN with this notion of the human rights economy.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's very important to take the preventative approach, as you say. So as we finalize this, as we come to the end of our webinar, perhaps I could take this time to give the panelists just a chance to say one sentence on the priorities for funding mandatory human rights mandatory human rights due diligence work moving forward. Just one sentence. What are your thoughts just as we wrap up? Maybe we can start with you, Oliver, since you're on the spotlight. Olivia?
Yes, well, thank you. I think what we are all saying here is that due diligence frameworks, despite all their promises, will only be as effective as they can be used by the communities and workers affected by the development of global supply chains. And I think in a world in which we are returning to neo-mercantilism and protectionist policies, which is actually de-globalizing to a large extent with companies facing incentives to repatriate their assets and to produce more locally, it is in a way an opportunity because globalization can only be rescued if it works for the benefit of workers and communities who are involved in global supply chains. So it's if any time, it is now that we must do more to defend due diligence, to defend workers and communities' ability to use due diligence frameworks in order to show that that can be a credible alternative to the retreat to protectionism.
Thank you so much. Defend workers in the community. Thank you, Mr. Olivia. I would invite, let's take you, Ben, and then Grace.
I think just given the time, we can go with just the speakers. So maybe
Okay, no
Grace.
problem. Gracie.
Thanks. I would say for the funders on the call, communities is where the shoe pinches. So if we're not funding where the rubber hits the road, where the shoe pinches, how do we expect change to happen? So let's build that trust-based support and fund where it hurts the most, where people are most affected. Thanks.
Thank you so much. fund where most people are affected. Thanks a lot. And Amalia?
Yes, two things. Well, from our perspective, which is to protect life on this planet. It's not only about humans, right? But it's really about humans. It's about how humans engage in everything, in every way, to protect the places where life is born. And in this sense, I'm thinking more about, you know, the expression that indigenous peoples use here in South America, the buen vivir. It's about how do you have a real life where you're not surviving only, that you are actually thriving, and with rights, with ability, with the perspective of future. And our 20-year, let's say, words, as we celebrate, we just launched our celebration. I hope we get to see and join us for the 20-year anniversary, is we can do more. And one thing for sure we know is we cannot do it alone. And I think conversations like this, where we actually find out about each other, and because we, you know, we have very many angles. We talk on environment, we talk on human rights, we talk on social justice, climate transition, just transition, but it's all the same, right? It is about how do we humans live, engage in every way in protecting the planet and improving the lives of all beings, including human, including having an ability for the humans to have a future, right? It is really about this right now. It's not only about jobs, and maybe we don't even need that many jobs if we can have a better life without, well, you know, without straining ourselves into the systems of capitalism. I think, of course, I don't see that we're going to dismantle it in anytime soon, but I think that we humans can reinvent ourselves, and that by repositioning our relationship to the planet and to life, and our role as responsible for, as one also responsible for protecting life on this planet, maybe we'll be happier and be stronger together to tackle the things that need to be changed, which of course we are fighting every day. So that's it.
Okay, thank you, Amalia. We should protect where life is born, in that we can do more, and we cannot do it alone. Thank you so much. And next, Joseph.
Thank you, Dorcas, and my fellow panelists for the able conversation. My parting shot is to call on the funders on the call to involve us in the discussions and designs of their funding strategies. The world is currently facing a lot of changes, and those changes affect or pose a risk on the ability of civil society actors, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, to continue doing their work. So we need to be part of the conversations as different donors design the funding strategies to ensure that no one is left behind, because for due diligence to be effective, the agency that civil society has to be functional for communities to benefit and for workers to be able to benefit, and those along the value and supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We should involve, the coalitions must be involved in the designs of the funding strategies for workers and communities to benefit, as well as other stakeholders. Thank you so much, Mariana.
Thank you, Dorcas. I guess I would say, and this is my role, right? We can indeed think and believe there is an alternative possible to neoliberalism. I think there is a book we co-published not too long ago called Writing the Economy, where we say that it's very important to have destabilizing work in order to drive towards this post-neoliberal economy or economies. And for us, it's definitely rights-based. So for me, to funders is fund structural work. Do you believe that, you know, long-term and fund long-term flexible core work? And do you believe in some of the that work that is going towards a very, very imaginative, solutions-driven future. That's what I would say. Fund the toolkit, not only the tool. Fund the whole toolbox. That's
on the whole toolbox. Thank you so much, Mariana. I think our panelists have shared their last words. And Ben, do you have anything before I close?
Please go ahead and close it off.
Okay, I think we've gotten to that time where we just thank you guys. Thank you, panelists, for making time for this webinar. We really appreciate, and we thank you, donors who have joined to listen to us, and other members from the civil society. Thank you so much for making time for this. Thank you so much, Ben, for working so hard. And yeah, we hope to take this conversation forward the other time. So with this, we really appreciate and we want to thank you all. Thank you.